Welcome, everybody, to Postgame Takeaways with Inside ND Sports. I'm Tyler James. He's the one and only Eric Hansen. We may be weather delayed by an hour, but we're ready to share our postgame takeaways from Notre Dame's dominant 49-7 victory over Stanford. Eric, what was your biggest takeaway from Saturday's game?
My biggest takeaway was that the passing offense was much more apparent than what caused the lightning delay. I didn't actually see lightning, and I understand how lightning delays work, but I did see, even in the context of Stanford not being a very good pass efficiency defense, I saw real progress in the passing game and something that Notre Dame could really build on. How about you?
Yeah, let me follow up to the passing game stuff, and then I'll share my biggest takeaway. Like, to me, the biggest part of the passing game was sort of like I said, Rylie Leonard learned how to putt with as a Happy Gilmore joke. Like, he took advantage of the easy throws that came off of RPO reads. He rifled 3 touchdown passes off of those looks, and sometimes that can be as simple as understanding what the defense is doing and recognizing that. Marcus Freeman attributed that a bit to the defense that Stanford plays, and probably explains why Stanford has such a poor pass defense, that some of those throws were easy and available to make. But I think it's also a good sign of what Leonard's capable of doing and how he's processing what he's seeing, which the second part of that I think has been a bit of a concern for Notre Dame through the first 6 games.
See, I felt like of all the player press conferences that we've done this year, there was the most meat on the bone in Rylie Leonard's post-game press conference. He talked about a couple things that really struck me. One was that he and Mike Denbrock's been trying to get him to see the game differently. And I think there's some resistance from just the way that you've learned things for 3 years at Duke. And also, I think there's some resistance in just not getting it. Mm-hmm. And I think Rylie Leonard had to understand the why part of the play calls. And he talked about that, and that they had these early morning talks about life and football with bagels and coffee before anybody got to the facility in the morning. And during the bye week and the week leading up to Stanford, it really hit home that Rylie Leonard finally had that aha moment. And I think it showed up today. It showed up in 16 of 22 passing. The first time that Rylie Leonard's gone over the 200-yard mark, he was at 229, and he came out before the end of the third quarter, gave way to Steve Angeli, who came in after the lightning delay with the rest of the second string offense. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was kind of a mental adjustment that he made during the bye week. You got the sense that the weight of the world was on his shoulders about getting this passing game open. And he just said, you know what? I need to just let her rip. I can't just have the weight of the world on my shoulders. I need to go out there and have fun. He said, these guys have been running routes their whole life. I've been throwing the ball my whole life. Why don't I throw it to them? I thought just kind of even the self-deprecation said something about Rylie Leonard. I thought it was really a telling moment. And I realize it's 49-7. It's Stanford. And yet I think sometimes these key moments in a season can be camouflaged. And I wouldn't be surprised if we looked back later in the season and said, aha, this is one of the very key moments when Rylie Leonard's progress took off. Now, again, progress isn't always a straight line, but I do feel like today was significant.
Yeah, and I'll hold off on my biggest takeaway, which is what I wrote about in my story on InsideNDSports.com, but sort of going off of that as this sort of maybe turning point for Notre Dame's offense. I felt like it was sort of the get-right game that the offense needed beyond just Rylie Leonard, too. A lot of players in Notre Dame's offense had things to be pleased with, whether it's a touchdown run for Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price bouncing back from his fumble that led to a benching in the Louisville game. He gets 49 yards and a touchdown. The throws that Leonard's making downfield to receivers that haven't had a ton of opportunities to make plays, Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, KK Smith, Jaden Thomas, big moments for all of those guys. So, yeah, I think beyond just Leonard, it felt like a game where the offense, particularly when they're putting things away in the third quarter, that it's like, okay, this is what we need. This is what we're capable of. Yes, our opponent in Stanford isn't the most stout defensively, but these are the kind of things that we can do when we're all on the same page and rolling in the right direction.
And I'm going to put your takeaway on mothballs for just until I have another sip of coffee and give another really deep thought here.
All right. I'll let you do that.
And I think also what I wrote in my column at InsideNDSports.com was how this kind of tied in the key figures in this really weird pass completion. It was Rylie Leonard, to of all people, Pat Coogan, who is the center on the team. And Pat confessed that this was the first time that he had caught a pass in his organized football career. And it careened off of Chris Mitchell and a couple of defenders and into the arms of Pat Coogan, who decided to run toward the end zone, which was a good thing, good instinct. He got 11 yards and a first down out of it. But I just thought it was an interesting moment in how Rylie Leonard arrived at that moment and how Pat Coogan arrived at that moment. I mean, this is a guy that started 13 games. He was the only offensive lineman on the team that started all 13 games last year. He gets beaten out in fall camp by a sophomore. This guy's a senior. And then they have a season-ending injury at a different position, center. He goes and plays center and plays his best football, I think, of his career. I think he's a lot better this year than he was last year. But it's how he's kind of pulled the team along with him, that attitude about, I think they could have really had a lost season after the Northern Illinois game. And I think one of the reasons they didn't was because Pat Coogan was getting on people when he wasn't even a starter. He was showing leadership.
Yeah.
And he was also, now he's leading by example and by catching passes. So I thought that was really interesting. I do want to finish up with Rylie Leonard too. His 205.2 pass efficiency rating is the highest of his career at Duke or Notre Dame against an FBS opponent. He had a couple of higher games against FCS teams, but the best against an FBS opponent. So I did want to throw that in there. And he also had 31 rushing yards on 6 carries and had his 8th rushing touchdown.
All right. The big takeaway that I wrote about.
Yes, let's get to that. This better be good because we put it off really long.
It's just that Notre Dame's defensive line keeps finding answers. Today it was Joshua Burnham making his triumphant return with 4 tackles, 1 for a loss, and a forced and recovered fumble by picking off a pitch by quarterback Ashton Daniels. He's battled his way back from an ankle injury, maybe slower than he had hoped, but was out there. And Marcus Freeman even said something to the fact that you see him in practice. I wasn't even sure if he'd be able to play because it doesn't look like he's fully healthy, but he was able to play well today. Gabriel Rubio made his first appearance of the season after a foot injury, sidelined him since the first preseason practice. So some reinforcements on the interior, which was extra important today because Jason Onye missed the game due to personal reasons. Marcus Freeman said Notre Dame found out about that on Friday. So Notre Dame had to be prepared to not have one of its reserve defensive tackles, and Rubio was able to step in and play some snaps today. And then the 2 starting defensive tackles, Howard Cross, the third, and Rylie Mills, really stepped up their play. I think we've been seeing improved play as of late this season, but I think for the most part this season they haven't necessarily played to the standard that many expected from them.
Yeah.
They combined for 3 sacks between the 2 of them today. Cross had a pair in 1 4-play stretch that halted Stanford's second drive of the game. He gets a sack on first down and then gets a sack on fourth down. That's a pretty good way to stop Stanford's momentum. And that was at a point of the game. It's 7-7 and Stanford's driving into Notre Dame territory. And that's a big moment for Notre Dame's defense to sort of settle down and have that 4th down stop and get things moving in a positive direction for the Notre Dame's defense. So despite the odds, despite being without Boubacar Traore and Jordan Botelho for the rest of the season, Notre Dame's defensive line keeps stepping up.
Tyler, too, either you misspoke or I misheard, but Josh Burnham actually had 5 tackles. He broke his career high. He has a career high.
All right. Well, there we go.
Okay. So, and he played a lot of Viper today. He played mostly Viper, which was his old position last year, and where Notre Dame really needed some reinforcements with Jordan Botello and Boubacar Traore going down for the year. I thought he did a fantastic job. And the play where he tipped the option pitch and then caught it himself and ran 15 yards down the field. I'm still interested that goes as a fumble recovery and return, but okay. Yeah. There were a lot of things that the officials ruled today that I wasn't really quite sure about.
Yeah, I feel like there's been moments in the past where it's like, well, that was a fumble, but it never hit the ground, so they call it an interception. But this time it was a fumble, so I don't know that I fully have the knowledge of the rules there. So we're deferring to the official box score, and that was a fumble recovery and a forced fumble, I guess, for batting that in the air and picking it off. But even Marcus Freeman called it an interception when he was speaking about it in the post game. Yeah.
Well, and when you were talking about how the defense played in the defensive front, I mean, it was quite a turnaround because Stanford went 63 yards on their first drive of the game pretty easily. They eased down the field. They didn't have to labor at all. And you're like, whoa, this is not the Notre Dame defense I expected to see. And then they showed up. You know, they only allowed 65 more yards the rest of the first half, and I think 67 in the second half, for a total of 200. And it was impressive. And they did end up stopping the run with a really good dual threat quarterback. I think Ashton Daniels, at least as a runner, is pretty good.
Yeah, but he entered the game with a pass efficiency rating that was worse than Rylie Leonard's, and there aren't a ton of starting quarterbacks that have worse than Rylie Leonard's this season.
Well, and it wasn't very good today. And Alec Ayamanar, who is a really good receiver, had 3 catches for 16 yards. You really didn't even notice him.
Yeah,
except when they said his name, and we were saying, are we mispronouncing it? Are they mispronouncing it? What's going on here?
Yeah, Daniels' issue is that he turns the ball over too much. And maybe that happens when you're on a team where there's just not a lot going offensively. But I think there's definitely talent there, but Stanford hasn't been able to maximize it yet. I had one more takeaway that I wanted to mention before we get out of here, and that was on the negative side, that it's time to keep an eye on the special teams once again. Mitch Jeter left the game with a tight groin after a kickoff following the first PAT of the game for Notre Dame. So that's not a great sign. Notre Dame was fine today with Zach Yoakum stepping up to do the PATs, but Notre Dame didn't have to attempt any field goals.
I think Marcello Diomede actually kicked one as well.
Yeah. When the backups came in, even the third string place kicker came in for a PAT.
Notre Dame flexed its kicking depth.
That's right. Yeah, someone in our game thread was like, "How many kickers do they have on the roster?" I was like, "Well, there's actually 5 of them. I don't know that they would ever use all of them, but." And then the James Rendell, he only punted once, but that one punt was terrible. It was 24 yards. Now you can shrug that off, but he had been playing better as of late. But that was more of like the James Rendell we saw at the beginning of the season than we had in more recent games. So. Those things didn't really matter for Notre Dame today, certainly. But as we've seen at times throughout the season, special teams has hurt the Irish at times. And the 2 most important kicking aspects of the team didn't have good news today. Anything else before you want to get out of here?
Well, I'll tell you what, this is going to be a really interesting October. Georgia Tech's next week in Atlanta. They moved to 5-2 today, I believe, is the record. And they beat North Carolina. They ran for almost 400 yards on North Carolina. And I know North Carolina's defense isn't very good, including a 68-yard run with 16 seconds left to break a 34-34 tie. And then Navy sitting there at 5-0, waiting in East Rutherford, New Jersey. I think they're pretty good too. This is going to be a really interesting October, when it looked like, was kind of the snooze month when you looked at the schedule on paper at the beginning of the season.
And we'll be covering it all for InsideNDSports.com. That is it from us in South Bend with Eric, and LaPorte for me. Please hit the subscribe button. Give us a like before you close out the video if you haven't done so already. You can subscribe to us at InsideNDSports.com with a 30-day free trial using promo code NDYT. And we want to hear your biggest takeaways from Saturday, so let us know in the comments. All right, we will see you.
Watch us on Football Never Sleeps Monday at 7.
That's right. We'll see you Monday night.